The MLB draft is just around the corner, and while the draft is basically similar in format to other pro leagues, the outcomes can often be much more unique. It's clear why this is the case. There's so many more players. Look at the length of drafts across American sports leagues. The MLB draft is so much larger than the rest, so it's easy to see why there are so many stories to tell. Today we're going to look at some of the weirdest MLB draft stories. Where do we start? Let's head to 1987. The Seattle Mariners were given the first overall pick as the result of an old draft rule. Why do I mention this? Well, the Mariners didn't actually have the worst record in 1986. They actually sat one spot behind the Pittsburgh Pirates. However, an old draft rule did not allow teams from the same league to be given the first overall pick in back-to-back seasons. So, while the Mariners had a better record than the Pirates in 1986, the Mariners were in the American League, so they were given the pick. In preparation for the selection, the Mariners narrowed down the selection to 2 players. There was one player the majority of the front office was planning to select. However, the Mariners owner turned his eye on a different player, Mike Harkey, an All-American right-handed pitcher from Cal State Fullerton. In response, the Mariners scouting director told his scout Bob Harrison to doctor the scouting report of the player they all wanted. He wanted Harrison to add even more praise to the scouting report to sway the owner. In the end, it worked, as the Mariners did not select Harkey, who ended up being selected 4th overall by the Cubs. So, who was the player that the Mariners front office rallied behind?
Let me tell you something about heroes. They ain't like you and me. Look at Griffey, the way he taps the spikes and grows the tee, punches the glove and flips the lid, signs the hat, eats the dirt, and twirls the lumber. Let me tell you about guys like him. They ain't just playing stick.
It's safe to say that the fake scouting report worked like a charm. Once Griffey made his debut 2 years after the 1987 draft, he was well on his way to becoming the coolest player in baseball, bringing a young, unsuccessful Seattle Mariners franchise along for the ride. Griffey ended up becoming a first-ballot Hall of Famer, becoming the first ever #1 overall pick to be enshrined at Cooperstown. This really speaks to the unpredictability of the MLB draft. It really makes you wonder how many #1 overall picks have failed. Well, what I can tell you is that through the entire history of the draft, 2 players who were selected #1 overall never made the big leagues. Those 2 players are Steve Chilcott and Brian Taylor. Chilcott was a catcher drafted by the Mets in 1966. In his first full season in the minor leagues, he dislocated his shoulder diving back to second base. Multiple injuries later, and Chilcott was out of baseball by age 24. Who was the 2nd overall pick in the 1966 draft? Oh, just an outfielder named Reggie Jackson. Don't worry though, back in the January 1966 draft, the Mets selected pitcher Tom Seaver, who turned out to be pretty good. I'm not going to tell you Seaver's college ineligibility story, but I did talk about it in a Butterfly Effect video on the Stark Raving Sports channel. Go check that out later if you're interested. Alright, so who was the 2nd #1 overall pick to never make the big leagues? That player was 1991 first overall pick, pitcher Brian Taylor. After a couple seasons in the minor leagues, Taylor was injured in December 1993 as he attempted to throw a punch in a fight. He dislocated his shoulder and tore his labrum, causing him to miss the entire 1994 season. He would never pitch above AA, and his career ended in 2000. This just shows how difficult it is to project high school and college players. These 2 players were the best in their draft class and were never able to realize their potential, while some players who were never touted to do anything actually ended up making noise in the big leagues. This leads to the question, who is the lowest draft pick to ever play a big league game? Well, there's not really a clear answer. Let me explain. In 1996, pitcher Clay Condrey was drafted in the 94th round by the New York Yankees, though he wouldn't sign with the team. 2 years later, Condrey signed with the San Diego Padres as an undrafted free agent. He would make his major league debut in 2002. However, is he really the lowest draft pick to ever play a big league game? Yeah, he was drafted in the 94th round, but he never signed with the team who drafted him. A player who does hold that distinction is pitcher Travis Phelps, an 89th round pick in 1996, coincidentally the same year Condrey was drafted. Unlike Condrey, Phelps signed with the team who drafted him, the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, eventually making his big league debut in 2001. So the question I want answered is, who's really the lowest draft pick to ever play a big league game? Does it matter that Condrey never signed with the team who drafted him? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Speaking of low draft picks, who's the lowest pick to ever make the Hall of Fame? That player is Mike Piazza, who not only was drafted in the 62nd round of the 1988 draft by the Dodgers, he was in the same Hall of Fame class as Ken Griffey Jr. However, Piazza may never have been in this position if it wasn't for his father, Vince. You see, Tommy Lasorda was the manager of the Dodgers at the time, and Vince Piazza was close friends with him. It seemed his son Mike was destined to be undrafted, so his father asked Lasorda to draft Mike as a favor. A scouting report from 2 years prior didn't paint a great picture, saying Piazza had no knowledge of first base. You might say, well, Piazza was a catcher, so why does that matter? Well, he actually came into the draft as a first baseman. In order for Lasorda to convince the front office to draft Piazza, he had to switch positions, ultimately choosing on catcher. And well, the rest is history. Speaking of drafting players as favors, you know who else was drafted as a favor? The son of Ken Griffey Jr., Trey Griffey. Well, this actually wasn't really a favor directed by Griffey or his family. In the 24th round of the 2016 MLB draft, Trey Griffey was drafted by the Seattle Mariners, which of course was the number of his father. However, Griffey hadn't played baseball since he was 11 years old. At that point, his eyes were set on the NFL. This selection was nothing more than creating a feel-good story, like how football players are drafted in the final rounds of the MLB draft. How did Griffey perform as a football player? Well, he went undrafted in the 2017 NFL draft and was never more than a practice squad player for a few years. Maybe he can do what Russell Wilson did and spend a game on the spring training roster. But who knows if the Mariners even still have Griffey's draft rights. While on the topic of players who didn't sign with their teams, there has been a total of 3 players who have been selected number 1 overall and did not sign with their new team. The first player was catcher Danny Goodwin, who the Angels made the number 1 overall pick in 1975. An arm injury limited him to a DH role for the rest of his career. However, 4 years prior to this pick, Goodwin was also drafted at number 1 overall in the 1971 draft, this time by the White Sox. He never signed with them as he opted to go to college, but yes, Goodwin was drafted as the number 1 overall pick twice. Tim Belcher was another player selected number 1 overall twice. He was initially drafted in the 1983 June draft by the Twins, but he opted not to sign. He was later drafted by the Yankees in the 1984 January draft. Belcher would have a solid career. He was even a key component of the Dodgers' 1988 World Series squad. The third and final player who was drafted at number 1 overall and didn't sign with their team was Brady Aiken. He was drafted in 2014 by the Houston Astros, who were at the tail end of their period of tanking. However, following the selection, concerns arose about Aiken's health, specifically with elbow inflammation in his throwing elbow. After some back and forth, he didn't sign with the team. Aiken entered the 2015 draft and was selected by the Cleveland Indians at number 17 overall. However, he had Tommy John surgery prior to the draft, and he was never able to fulfill his potential. Another former number 1 overall pick I want to mention is Chipper Jones, the second number 1 overall pick to make the Hall of Fame. Braves fans, if there is anyone to thank for Jones becoming a Brave, it's Todd Van Poppel. Heading into the 1990 draft, high school starting pitcher Todd Van Poppel was not only at the top of the Braves draft board, he was seen by many scouts as a can't-miss prospect. However, he wanted to go to college and pitch in the 1992 Olympics. Apparently, the Braves offered him a 7-figure bonus days before the draft, but he wouldn't budge, so the Braves drafted Chipper Jones instead. Jones became a Hall of Famer, and Van Poppel's career essentially went the opposite way. Alright, one more story. We've seen players be drafted number 1 overall and not sign with their team, so really anything can happen. Well, have you heard the story of Matt Harrington? Heading into the 2000 draft, Harrington was regarded as one of the top talents available. However, his agent, Tommy Tanzer, had scared off many teams with the bonus demands for Harrington. He was selected by the Rockies at number 7 overall, but his asking price of $4.95 million was just too high. In fact, the two sides became more strained as negotiations went on. Harrington decided to enter the draft again in 2001 and was selected in the second round by the San Diego Padres. After another long period of negotiations, the Harrington family fired and sued agent Tommy Tanzer for mishandling negotiations. Harrington would hire Scott Boras as his new agent. The Padres offered $1.2 million, but Harrington didn't sign, electing to enter the following draft. You want to know how long this cycle goes? For 3 more years. Yes, Harrington was drafted 5 times and didn't sign with a single team. His dreams of playing in the big leagues ended in 2007 after being released by the Cubs. To put it into perspective, only 1 in 200 high school seniors are eventually drafted by an MLB team. And between 1981 and 2010, 73% of first-rounders ended up making a big league team, with that number slowly falling round by round. Harrington's story actually goes a lot deeper than what I've covered, but for the purposes of the video, I wanted to simplify the story. I'll leave an article in the description if you want to read his full story. So this concludes the weird draft stories. Like I said earlier, if you want to learn more about Tom Seaver's college ineligibility and how that allowed the Mets to draft him, check out the video on Stark Sports. And I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks for watching.